Hello everyone, good morning, good evening, namaste. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So, today we are going to try and understand Cube basic configuration starting from step 1 and let's see if I'll be able to cover this Cube basic configuration in one video or not, or else I'll create another video to complete the basic configuration. Before we start, I'll request new viewers to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps me to create and motivate me in creating new videos for you guys. I would also like to ask the viewers and subscribers that would you like me to create this video in Hindi as well? Because there was one or two subscribers who asked me to create videos in Hindi. So if I get more responses, I'll go for Hindi as well. So let's start. So Cube's basic configuration starts with integrating the Cube, a Cisco router, with Call Manager server using a SIP trunk. So the first step is to connect your Cube router to Call Manager using a SIP trunk. So how to create a SIP trunk in Call Manager is we have to navigate to device trunk as shown in this image, and then we have to start configuring this SIP trunk. Next step is to select the trunk type as SIP trunk and device protocol and as SIP, then move on to the next configuration. Next important configuration is your device name. It can be any sensible device name, maybe a SIP trunk to Cube, PSTN Cube SIP trunk, any which will be a meaningful name, which you will be able to understand why we have created this trunk or to which device this trunk is pointing to. So any meaningful name. A description, so you can add more description to that name, and a device pool. It's an important configuration part. A device pool is needed here. Next, the important configuration in a SIP trunk is we have to enter the SIP information. So SIP information include the destination IP address to which the SIP trunk would be pointing to, and a port number. By default, SIP port number is port 5060. It's TCP UDP 5060. So the destination address when you are configuring or trying to connect your Cube to the Call Manager would be the LAN interface of the Cube. Let me show you. So if you guys have gone through my previous video where I haven't you know uh, where I have created one video, maybe it was a dial pair or some video, I forgot, and I did try to make you understand what is the LAN interface and WAN interface of the Cube. So if this is the call flow where we have IP phone registered on Call Manager, a SIP trunk to the Cube, and a SIP trunk towards the provider. So when you are creating a SIP trunk in the Call Manager, a SIP trunk in the Call Manager, so this SIP trunk will point to the LAN interface. This would be the LAN, sorry, LAN interface of the Cube. So it will have IP address. It can be any interface, a gig interface, loopback, any interface that you have configured. It should be up, should have IP address, and that IP address, the IP address of this interface, should be entered here in the SIP trunk configuration, SIP information section under the destination IP address here. So this will be the LAN interface of the Cube with a port number which is default as 5060, and we have to choose a proper SIP trunk security profile and a SIP profile, depends on the organization. After this, these are the basic configuration of a SIP trunk in the call manager. After this, apply config and your SIP trunk is ready. After that, since we are dealing with basic cube configuration, first step is done. Your cube is now talking to call manager through the SIP trunk. The second step before we configure the cube is you have to get in touch with your service provider, the ITSP, and ask these details. Get these details. This will be needed when you configure your cube, the dial pairs, and other basic necessary information that we have to enter in the cube. So you should be asking the SIP trunk IP address, the destination IP address where the from SIP trunk from cube to provider will point. So we need this IP address because while creating the VoIP dial peer, we will be entering the session target as this IP address, the IP address of the provider. Then the port number by default is 5060, but provider might be using a different port number, which is possible. So ask for the port number, the transport layer they are using because it can be used in UDP, TCP both, codecs they support, fax protocol, DTMF signaling they need, or they support which can be in band, out of band, anything. Then ask the SDP information, whether they need the SDP in the initial invite, which is whether they need the invite to be an early offer or can it be a delay offer. SBC's external IP address. One more important information is, does provider want the SIP trunk to be registered in the queue? If yes, you have to ask the username and password. And does the service provider requires a digest authentication? If yes, ask for the username and password. If they don't want the SIP trunk to be registered with them, then you don't have to ask the username password, or you don't need a username and password. But the above details are needed because those have to be configured on the VoIP in the VoIP dial view. After you get this information, all the information from the service provider, move to the third step, enabling your Cisco router as a cube, or enabling the cube application on your Cisco router. That's very important. These are the basic configurations needed apart from the dial pairs, which we have already discussed that you will need in my previous videos, where you will need VoIP dial pairs for LAN inbound and outbound VoIP dial pairs, and WAN inbound and outbound dial pairs. So this is the LAN side, this is the WAN side. So point calls from N to the cube, you will need WAN dial pairs here, WAN dial pairs here, and to point calls to and from the call manager, you will need LAN dial pairs. I mean calls coming from call manager to the cube and calls going towards the call manager, you will need LAN incoming outgoing dial pairs. Same for service provider, incoming call from service providers and outgoing calls towards service providers, you will need WAN incoming and outgoing dial pairs. But before that, we have to enable the cube application. So what are those? So first is under voice service VoIP, which is the global configuration, you have to enter mode border element license capacity 15, which is not a mandatory command. This command is just enables the show cube CLI output. If you don't enter this command, mode border element license capacity, show cube will not work, which will not impact the functionality of cube. Mode border element license capacity 15 is means you are telling this cube that we will need 15 sessions, not more than that. Though this is not enforced, but it's up to you. This allow connection SIP to SIP is very important command and it is mandatory. Why? By default, a Cisco IOS or IOS XE does not allow a IP to IP call. By default, they allow IP to TDM call, which is can be a SIP to PRI, SIP to FXO, H323 to PRI FXO. They allow those configurations by default, those calls by default, but they don't allow IP to IP call by default. So continuing with the basic cube configuration where I was discussing how to enable cube application a Cisco router. So this command allow connections SIP to SIP has to be entered. This is mandatory command because Cisco iOS or iOS XE does not allow IP to IP call by default. It has to be enabled. By default, they allow IP to TDM, IP to PRI, IP to FXO, IP to digital analog calls, but they don't allow IP to IP calls, so it has to be enabled. Allow connections SIP to SIP. Now, if your cube have a H3232 SIP connection, which is also a cube, not recommended, but it can be cube and it will work. You have to add another command as allow connections H3232 SIP. That will be mandatory in that case. But there are very less H3232 SIP cubes. So this is the common command allow connections SIP to SIP. Next step is to configure media bulk stats. Again, this is not mandatory command, but whenever you run this command is needed to see your RxTX packet counters increase and decrease in iOS XE. So for example, when you run the commands show voice, active brief, or uh, show voice active brief is the command, I think, where you will be able to see the number of packets received and sent. If you don't enable media bulk stats, you won't be able to see the RxTX, the number of packets sent and received under that command. It will be 00 every time. So to troubleshoot voice related issues, please enable media bulk stats so that you will be able to see the number of packets sent and received when you use those command show voice media active brief and all. Now the third step is very important. We have to add all the trusted IP addresses in the queue. So we have to tell our queue that these are the IP addresses that you can trust. That means you can receive calls from these IP addresses. Now, by default, these IP addresses can be CUCM, from which we will be receiving call at the LAN interface. It can be ITSP's IP address, from which we will be receiving call on our WAN interface. It can be CVP. So any IP address that you want your cube to trust and receive calls, it has to be added under voice service VoIP, IP address trusted lease, and all the IP addresses. Now, by default, the IP addresses added under dial peer with session target, or when you create a server group, those IP addresses are by default trusted. You don't have to add those IP addresses here. Okay. So IP addresses in front of session target and in server group configuration are trusted by default. We don't have to add them here. Else you have to add the IP addresses. This is mandatory to prevent toll fraud. Why? Because before, as far as I remember, before 15.1 iOS, toll fraud prevention app was not enabled by default, but after 15.1 or maybe 15.3, this toll fraud prevention app is by default enabled in Cisco iOS, in Cisco routers, and that's why we have to add the trusted IPs specifically here. Now the last command SIP silent discard untrusted is a default configuration after 15.3. You don't have to add them. It's already added and it's part of trusted list section. So this is needed to mitigate TDOS attack, which is telephony denial of service attack. So TDOS, or telephony denial of service attack, is it's kind of flooding your organization or flooding your telephony system with malicious incoming calls. So to mitigate that TDOS, these configurations are needed. We have to add the trusted IP addresses. If your iOS is older than 15.3, we have to add silent discard untrusted, otherwise it's added by default. It's a default configuration after 15.3. So to summarize the basic cube configuration, create a SIP trunk from call manager to the cube. Destination IP address would be the LAN interface of the cube in the SIP trunk, and add all other configurations. Get in touch with your service provider, ask for these details from the service provider, and then final step is to enable your Cisco router as a cube and add this commands. So this is the basic configuration of the cube. Uh, Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll try to. Next video would be on the dial peer of cube specifically, where I'll be discussing the incoming and outgoing dial peers, LAN and WAN side both. Please like my video, subscribe to my channel, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.